Welcome to PaleyIMPACT, part of the Paley at Home series presented by Citi. I'm Charles Whitaker, Dean of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications. The Paley Center is dedicated to celebrating excellence in media, especially now. To help them continue to bring you outstanding programs like this one, please go to paleycenter.org to donate. Today, we'll discuss media's ability to educate and inform the public, especially during challenging times like those we're all living through today. I'm joined by Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, DeRay Mckesson, host of the podcast Pod Save the People, and former Ohio Governor John Kasich. Thank you all for joining us. I'm kind of a recovering journalist who's now pretending to be an academic, but the world that I live in is the world of grades, and that's the defining metric. So I'd actually like to start by asking each of you, how would you grade the performance of the media in terms of providing information during these wrenching times when, you know, the world is responding viscerally to police brutality? Mayor Bottoms, would you start?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, it's an honor to join you and the other panelists. I would give the media an A- on this. And the reason being, I know that you can't tell every single story each and every day, but I do think that there has been a great balance of coverage. And what I've been most pleased about, it's not just the negative parts of this story that are being told, but really, just in a very personal way. They are telling very personal stories, and the imagery has been very important, and I think really capturing the mood of the country. And then the thing that's really struck me is to see journalists and anchors shed tears, because we're so used to them being detached and working really hard not to be a part of the story. But I think this is where we are in America, and I've been reminded of the words of Paul Laurence Dunbar: "We wear the mask that grins and lies, that hides our cheeks and shades our eyes." And it seems as if the mask has been pulled off of America, and the media seems to be no exception.
Thank you. Mr. Mckesson, your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I think about what has changed since 2014, and it's good to be here and have this conversation, and honor to be alongside the other panelists who have led parts of government. So I'm excited to listen and learn too. I think about 2014 as a moment where I remember people like Don Lemon, who, you know, he was out there with us in Ferguson, and he was not pro-police, but he certainly was not pro-protester. And he was sort of like, you guys are being really dramatic and da-da-da. And I remember the day that Don got tear gassed, because he was like, they would never target me, they would never do this to me, and they targeted his van. He ran in that van so quick. And it was one of those moments that I think that, like, the difference between 2014 and 2020 in the protests is that even more reporters realize that it's not about what you do, it's not about how loud you were out there, it's not about whether you had a weapon or not, it's not about looting or not, that the police literally just inflict pain on people. So we've all seen the Black reporter who just got arrested for standing in the street. We've seen white reporters get shot at with rubber bullets. Like, I think that actually has changed so much the way the media reports, because they were very skeptical of us in 2014 as if we were dramatizing the situation. Whereas now I'm on the news and the reporter is even more intense than I am sometimes. And I'm like, you know what? Thank you. Because we are not making this up. And I will say what makes me sad about the difference between 2014 and now is that the outcomes haven't changed. The police have killed more people, not less. So, like, the reporting still, I think, has to get better so that the outcomes change.
Thank you. Governor Kasich, your thoughts? How are we doing?
You know, I thought the mayor should have given the media an A. She gave an A-. So I'm wondering what she found fault with. Listen, I think they've done a very good job. And I agree with much of Mr. Mckesson said from the standpoint of being able to show the emotion that's connected to people who have found themselves a target. Now, I'll tell you what I'm really concerned about, though. You know, there was a period of time when I was trying at the end of my term to pass some very significant gun control legislation. And I remember when we had the shootings, and if you took a look at the coverage, the media, you know, and if you look at a graph, Dean, you can take a look at this and show your students sometime, you could see the level of coverage and how high it was in the middle of the shootings. But it was very soon after that that the media kind of lost interest. You know, it was not getting the support. It wasn't getting the ratings. The same is true with social media. If you don't get clicks, you know, then you have to change to another subject. Well, I'm concerned that that's where this is going to go. That the media is going to focus on this basically as long as it rates, and then at some point they won't be covering it as much. So that leads to publications like the New Yorker or the Atlantic to do the in-depth stories, which, as you know, Dean, while they're great, there aren't that many people that read them. Yeah. And there is no question when you look at public opinion polls or you just talk to people, there's been a sea change in the minds of Americans here. And not just African Americans who have been under this problem and lived under this for a long period of time, but you find a lot of white folks that are now beginning to say, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that an African American mother, when she sends her son out to the grocery store or whatever, has to hold her breath about what's going to happen. There has been a change, in my opinion, in the attitudes of all Americans that something has to happen. And the question is, how long will the media focus on this? Will they lose interest? And as they lose interest, then the pressure to bring about significant change decreases. It's what happened with gun control. How long have we been talking about it? And yet nothing ever seems to change. And that's because the heat is not on. So I would hope that they will keep their focus. I'm actually in the media, and I'm determined to make sure they keep the focus as best they can. But up till now, I would give them a very high grade. And one other final thing is Marie Colvin was always a hero of mine. She's a lady who lost her life covering things. You have Judith Miller, who, you know, was courageous and was all over the world. These reporters, you just got to give them a lot of credit. They put themselves out there. They put themselves at risk. And I have a lot of admiration for them. Finally, I think it is important that the media is able to separate reporting from opinion. When you're a reporter, report what you see. When your opinion, express your opinion. But let's not confuse the two. I think that's important, and that would give the media, in my opinion, more credibility.
So you raised a couple of issues there that I wanted to follow up on. One is, you talked about the fading, the limited attention span of media, and once an event is sort of out of the headlines, it goes away. What do you think, Governor Kasich, returning to you, is the media's responsibility during a crisis like this, but also after the crisis? What are we supposed to be doing, and what should we be doing in the long run?
Well, there's a million stories that have been happening for a long period of time. We had some of them in Ohio, and they got attention, but then they kind of faded. It gets to be, to me, a matter of conscience. I mean, one of the things that I think the media has to do is, as they have historically in our country, is, you know, to dig down and remember the value system. And there are ways to keep this story out. And right now it's out there. It's out there big time. You know, you don't even hear much about the virus anymore because this story has overtaken it. But it's about whether people want to continue to talk about it. If you talk about gun control, there's always another story you can do on that. But you've got producers. They just don't seem to want to do it. If it doesn't rate, they don't want to do it. And there is a public service responsibility that comes with being part of the media. And I think they just have to think about it, and we have to call for it.
Mayor Bottoms, how about you? What do you think? What is our responsibility here? What should, during a national crisis, but again, beyond?
I think the responsibility is to inform, very simply put, but I think that it has to take on all forms. It's very different than when I was a journalism major at FAMU. We had a print course, we had a radio course, and we had a broadcast course. Those were the only mediums that were available to us. But even within my household, we all get our information differently, because it goes from my husband and I, who receive our information in this very traditional way, where we're on, whatever .com website, and we're looking at that traditional news. And then there is my 18-year-old who gets his news from Snapchat and Twitter sometimes, which is pretty old for him. And then there are my 9-year-old twins and my 12-year-old. When my 9-year-old son told me recently about some really negative ads against Joe Biden, I thought, well, where are you getting that from? But he watches wrestling YouTube and basketball on YouTube all day. And so I think it is, and this has been a challenge even for my team and I had a wonderful professor at FAMU who eventually became the dean, Dr. Hawkins. And something that's always in my mind, he would say, if Joe on the back of the Coca-Cola truck can't understand it, it's too complicated. And so we tend to have these very high level discussions and dissemination of information. And Dr. Hawkins is always in my head. I'm going, keep it simple, keep it simple, keep it simple. And my litmus test is when my mother takes this to her Bridge Club meeting on Saturday, how will they talk about it? And I think that's our responsibility. We've got to keep the message simple. I think there's a place for a very high level intellectual conversation. And it's not that the public is not smart enough to receive it, but we've just got to make sure that everybody can receive it and understand it. And I think that's the responsibility that we have as elected officials. And I think that's the responsibility for the media. There's sometimes when I watch news stories and I feel like there was a book I was supposed to read before I got to the story, because there's this assumption that the public is informed or is kept up with these events over the past 300 years. And I think we have to always remember that there's a part of the story that you've got to give the background, and then you've got to tell why it's important. And I don't think that that's always done.
Mr. Mckesson, Mayor Bottoms was talking about the various channels that her children receive news on. Technology has changed so much of what we do, not just our consumption of news, but our behavior. How has it changed activism or the nature of activism in the 21st century?
Yeah, so to back up a little bit to the question of the media sort of moving forward,
Go right ahead.
A lot of us who are thinking about what the backlash to the protest is going to be, that in 2014 we saw that there was a backlash. We saw sort of the Trumpism take hold, and it'll be interesting to see if the media sort of participates in that. If once the protest died down and people are upset about the focus on race and the focus on the police, will they stoke that flame? Will it just be Fox stoking the flame? Or will everybody sort of participate? You and I both know Trump is not going to stop tweeting. He's not going to stop the press conferences. So what will their role be? And to this question about how technology has helped us, there are two things. First is it's helped us with the pace of information. I can talk to 1 million people whenever I want to, all across the world. Messages can travel quicker and faster and spread in ways that they literally just couldn't before. So we just have new tools to build relationships and to share information. I think the second thing that's interesting is that all of these platforms in some ways are very different from when they began. They are platforms that users actually get to sort of shape and mold and make sort of work best for them. So you think about Twitter, it was users who created the hashtag. It was users who created the thread, right? It was users who pushed so much of the innovation. And I think that we see particularly Black people be so innovative on the internet in ways that allow us to build community differently. The hard part about the internet, though, as we all know on this panel, is that misinformation can spread very quickly. And by the time you are able to catch it, it might be something everybody already believes. So when Mayor Bottoms is talking about how do you make sure you always speak to, for me, it's I'm always trying to convince my aunt. If I can convince my aunt on anything, I can convince anybody, because my aunt is busy. She got 3 kids. She got 2 jobs. She is not watching CNN. So if I can convince her, I'm so with Kavanaugh, I wasn't talking about Roe v. Wade. With Aunt Mink, I was like, you know what, Aunt Mink, they hiding the papers. He had some papers from when he was a judge, and they hiding them. She they hiding the papers? I'm like, girl, they hiding the papers. It's bad. She said they can't hide the papers, DeRay. I'm like, they sure can't. And then I went into some other things, but I needed to get her in the room in the first place. But I say all that to say that I think the other side is a lot better at talking to my aunt. And I think that the consequences of that are far reaching. So some of the best sort of strategies and ideas from the left are like 10,000 words. And like, nobody is listening. You know, I barely understand it. So, you know, I think that we have to work on that. And with the police, it's things like defund the police have become sensationalized and people are like stressed out about it. And like, when I tell it to people, I'm like, you already believe it, right? Not a complex idea. You believe that experts should do what experts do. Who's an expert in mental health? Like, who should respond to mental health crises? An expert. The police shouldn't be going to somebody's house if they are dealing with suicidal ideation. Like, why should somebody, like, that's not like a complicated notion. Or like, who should be addressing homelessness in cities? Probably social workers, like not the police. And these ideas, that's not like a wild idea, but there's a way that people can sort of package it to sensationalize it. And I think that we actually just don't win in that space.
Dean, let me just jump in for a second. And when you think about these senators, okay, they try to run from office to office. And when they see a television camera, you think that they're afraid they're going to catch a disease, and they run as fast as they can unless there's something they want to say. Okay, so if we can make it simple, let me just give you an example. You're a member of the legislature, or you're a congressman or a senator. I've got a question for you. Do you favor background checks for the purchase of a gun? I mean, do you or do you not? Or let me give you this. Does your police agency have a policy on the use of deadly force? And do you train your officers to the policy on deadly force? Pretty simple. And if the media, and there's one thing that a politician doesn't want to have those people in their face. And I believe that the media, and this is not about harassing somebody, this is just trying to get a response. Okay, if you don't believe in background checks, tell me. If you do, I want to know that. And the local media, the person that stands there with that microphone, with that camera, is very, very powerful. And then you combine that with what Mr. Mckesson's doing with a podcast or something on social media or Twitter, where I think we're all beginning to realize you got to have a conscience. It's not all about clickbait. Okay, and if it comes together in a kind of a way in which it converges, these people will be running for the hills. They'll be passing things. They'll be bringing about changes. But all of a sudden it fades away, or you're really looking for, oh, I have to have access to this person and that person. Then it doesn't work very well. So the media is so critical in terms of shining a light on what the problems are. And it's not about, it's about them being able to hold people accountable. And I've held office for almost 30 years, and I think it was 30 years, and accountability was part of what I had to deal with.
Mayor Bottoms, how has social media changed the way you relate to and communicate with both the media, the press, but also the public, your constituents?
Oh, it's changed everything. And again, thinking about who I'm speaking to and how. And so I still do things the old-fashioned way. I still do robocalls. I still do emails because I know that's how my mother would get her information. But then there's this whole different side that I've got to communicate. Now, I'll just give you an example. So this whole conversation around defunding the police. On my desk, this is my City of Atlanta budget book. But if you look on social media, there's a screenshot that says, this is the budget, and it's a simple message. So I'm now trying to explain this and all that's in here to a group that's getting their information in bullet points. And it becomes very, very challenging. And I have to remind myself that, again, you've got to simplify. So there's some people who, and I learned this during my campaign. I remember doing a focus group and a group of women saying they get their news from Instagram. And I was blown away because I thought, who gets their news from Instagram? Well, a whole bunch of people get, perhaps not me, even though I do get it a little more now because after I heard that in the focus group, I knew that I needed to get on Instagram if I wanted to be able to communicate my message. But it is challenging, and I can say, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day. If there's anything that Donald Trump got right, was learning how to communicate via social media with folk and pushing his message out and going around the mainstream media. So it is a constant challenge, and it is often very frustrating trying to articulate the same point to my 70-year-old voter as I'm trying to articulate to my 22-year-old voter, and figuring out how I can succinctly communicate it in a way that they both receive it and understand it.
Governor Kasich, your time in public service spans, you know, pre-social media and internet to, not that I'm saying you're old, to today, but what has changed for you in terms of the way you think about communicating with, again?
I adopt all of it and use all of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I do, you know, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I just did a big thing with Sophia Bush on Instagram on mental health, which I think is one of the DeRay mentioned this, you know, mental health issues, not just for adults, for children. And so I'm on there with Sophia Bush. She's got about 3.5 million followers. I just got the videographer of Justin Bieber, Rory Kramer, just posted some stuff. You use it and you follow it, and you try to, you've got to be precise, but you know, I think you have to be precise when you put a bumper sticker together. You can't have a long sentence. You have to be, you have to know how to get on there and get your message out clearly. I don't think the mayor has to spend a whole lot of time thinking about her ability to communicate, because I think she's unbelievable. I mean, that press conference she had, I mean, I'm telling you, I was blown away by how effective and wow. And I think, I don't know her very well. I'm going to get to know her. I think she's going to be a terrific leader. And I think she's doing just great. You just keep doing what you're doing there, Mayor, and everything should work out. And you know what? I have twins that are 20 years old, and believe me, they're not much removed from what they might see on the CBS Evening News, or I mean, they get a lot of their news on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, but they're right. They got it. I mean, and they're 20 years old, and it's not like there's a disconnect, you know. Maybe a little bit more controversy around what's, you know, the traditional reporting versus reporting that's a little bit more aggressive. But I think it's great. I just hope that the social media, all media, just has a conscience. That's what I think matters. Character. It's not just about making the next buck. That's how we got in trouble with the virus to some degree. You got to make the next buck so we don't have any masks or any equipment because it's all being made overseas. Because I got to make $1 more. I mean, we're all for making $1, but if that's the end of it all, forget it. You know, so, you know, it's a lot of responsibility when you have a pen or a camera or a voice.
Mayor Bottoms, Governor Kasich invoked that press conference, which was an amazing moment in time. Did you have any idea that it would resonate with the country the way it did?
No, and thank you, Governor, for that. I didn't, and in fact, my sister had a good laugh with me yesterday. She said, when I saw you come out and you hadn't combed your hair and put on lipstick, I knew something big was about to happen. But I really didn't. I just, and I guess this is when the instincts come in. And as an elected official, sometimes that's all you have to go on. I knew what was happening in the streets. I wanted to go out there that night, and our police department and some others had said no, that my going out would make it worse. So I just told my team, get the cameras in, because I knew we had to say something. And when I walked in, I didn't know what I was going to say. And honestly, when I was done, I didn't know what I had said. I just remember thinking, that either went really right or it went really wrong.
It was totally unscripted. You had no notes?
No notes. And I did something that morning that I never find time to do. I was thinking about the call I had made to my son where I asked him to come home, and I wrote down my feelings about that call. So I guess that was top of mind for me. I had written it down, which again, I don't ever do that. And I did it because it struck me in such a way that I, as mayor, that I knew I couldn't protect him out there. And so anyway, in last year, I went through the Bloomberg Harvard Mayor School, and they took us through this wonderful course, and part of it was the art of storytelling. And so it's always top of mind for me when I'm writing speeches. You know, they taught us is 3 parts: story of me, story of us, where do we go from here, essentially. And what struck me was when I went back and I listened to the speech that I spoke it in those 3 categories subconsciously. So I didn't know what I was going to say. And I guess over the past year, I've been thinking about how you convey a message, but I didn't think of any of that when I walked in that room. The only thing that I could think of was what was happening in our city. And thankfully it translated to so many other people.
It did. It certainly, as I said, resonated, I think, around the country. I think everyone sort of felt, it was a very heartfelt moment, and I think everyone certainly felt that and appreciated that.
Thank you.
Mr. Mckesson, you were pretty positive about the press coverage in your opening remarks, but there are people who were sort of annoyed. There was some consternation about the coverage of the protest and the amount of attention given to, say, peaceful protests versus the violence that was happening in the streets, or the looting, if you will, and whether or not it should be called looting, and whether or not the press was focusing more on property versus people. I was just wondering your thoughts about how the protests have been characterized and how we should be talking about those and talking about the nature of the unrest when it takes a different turn.
Yeah, you know, my perspective is informed by 2014 when it was so different and so wild. So like, this is infinitely better than 2014. You know, I'm always interested in the way people use language. Like, we think about violence as harm against people. We think about property damage as damage to property. People sort of conflate those two in the protests. They're like, the protesters were being violent. It's like, I don't know. I saw the police shoot people with rubber bullets. I saw the police drag people out of cars and sort of bust windows of cars and drag them down the street. I saw police throw people on the ground. I didn't see protesters do that. I saw protesters damage property, and we should talk about these two in conversation with each other, but we should not pretend that they are the same. So when I think about my friend who has permanently lost her eye because she got hit with a rubber bullet, or I think about my other friend who is worried about having permanent brain damage now because he got hit in the head with a rubber bullet at a close range, that is in no way comparable to a Target not having as many products as they had the day before. So that is sort of like my challenge with the way the media sort of works. I will also say, and this is not, you know, I know I'm on a panel with two elected officials at some point, is that one of the things that has been really hard for me is to watch the media just let mayors and governors and city council people, the whole gamut, senators, say all this stuff about police when they had the power to make a whole host of changes before this moment and chose not to. So when I'm in a room and I'm like, okay, I like listen to this press conference, I hear this thing, and it's like, well, your police department killed 12 people last year. And the media is just sort of like la-di-da about that, and that doesn't seem fair. So the protesters have to account for like every window broken, and it is odd to me that mayors and governors and sheriffs, the whole gamut, police chiefs, are being allowed to be at these press conferences and be unchallenged. And the reason that matters is because the only reason people are in the street, the only reason is because the police kill people. Like, that's it. That's what got us there. People are staying there for a host of other things, but we would not be in the street if the police hadn't killed people. So when I think about, you know, there's only one city in America from 2013 to 2019 that killed nobody, and that's Irving, California. So everybody else has a lot, like something at least to explain to us, and I have been shocked at the media's refusal to sort of push mayors and push governors to make us understand.
And can I say a little bit about it?
Go
Because
ahead.
one of the reasons why I wanted to come on here was to talk about the things that we did in Ohio. Started off early with criminal justice reform, banning the box so that people who were nonviolent felons wouldn't be excluded from jobs. We offered alternatives for prison for people to be able to stay in the community. Our recidivism rate out of our prisons was low because we trained people for job skills once they got out and gave them mental health and drug treatment in the prisons. It's not because I'm such a great guy, but we had a great cabinet, great people around. And then of course we did our police and community, where we now have, like I mentioned earlier, 80% of our police agencies actually defining the use of deadly force and defining the use of force and training police officers to those standards, which is what is critical. We have instigated within the police agencies, focusing on recruiting so that the recruiting reflects more of the community. And one thing that I think that everybody was stunned, people who have studied these issues, is the use of data. All arrests, all interactions get recorded so that we can see whether there's a systemic bias. And all of these police agencies, like 80% of them, have adopted all of this, and including the use of body cameras. But we think out here, this is something I did with Nina Turner, who is, as I was mentioning to the mayor before we came on, African-American, very smart woman, a very unique person. She was the chairman of the Bernie Sanders campaign. She and I are really connected on this and many other issues. We did this together because we believed that we needed to get ahead of things. And that was after Tamir Rice. You might remember the 12-year-old boy who was shot and killed in Cleveland, and after the Brelo case and the case where the man was killed in Walmart, they came to see me. And by enacting these things, and these are real things that can be studied and reviewed, we had that convention in Cleveland, 4 days, not one single broken window, not one. The community came together. I think it is possible to make progress. Frankly, the President of the United States ought to have these federal guidelines. They ought to require the police departments across this country to enact them. And if you won't enact them, you lose your federal grants, something that matters a lot to them. So what I'm concerned about is that we move forward, that we get these things done, that we get something solid in place. And I think we can. I think that if we can keep the pressure on, I think we will. Because it's not just what people in the African American community are demanding. There's a growing feeling among all people that this needs to be done, that this sense of justice is missing. Remember, that was what made a difference with what Martin Luther King did. You know, it wasn't the politicians at the top, it was the people, because all change comes from the bottom up. It all comes from the bottom up. And people demanded it, whether it was African Americans and white folks who got involved in the movement, the fact that they got ministers, everybody said enough of this. Now, we haven't made enough progress, but it's going to come from the bottom up. And I believe it can happen in this country if we keep about it. And so, Mr. Mckesson, I'm more optimistic. I think you're optimistic too, but we got to keep it going, right? And there are things that we can do that can send a message to folks that we hear you, you're not alone, and we're going to change America. And I believe that consensus is building. I just hope the media doesn't lose interest.
Well, that's a good question. So what do we do how does the media get that message out? What should the media be doing to sort of keep these topics at the forefront, to illuminate the issues and the policies that you prescribed, Governor Kasich?
They have to keep covering it, and they've got to find the angles for it. All they need to do is say, what's happening with your police department? Have you brought the changes in? It's almost like what Mr. Mckesson is saying here about holding people accountable. What have you done to enact a policy so that we know how to use deadly force or the use of force? What is the data that you have? What is it that you're showing about systemic problems when it comes to reviewing data? What are you doing about recruiting more police officers? What are you doing, by the way, about examining them over time? You know, what about their performance? Does it apply to the standards that you put in place? I think that's always going to be, I think it'll rate. You know, I have my opinions about what rates on television and what doesn't. And sometimes if you lead with it or you stay on it, and social media stays on it, and I can tell you, Mr. Mckesson, with his podcast, and I'm going to be starting a podcast, I'm going to talk about it. It's got to keep it going, Dean. Keep it going.
Mayor Bottoms, your thoughts? How should the media be focusing on this, bringing attention to reform and change?
Well, I think everything that was just said, which is really the heart of this conversation we're having, right? How you convey information to the masses. And so when I'm doing a 2-minute interview on CNN or MSNBC or whatever the venue is, they're not going to ask all of those questions on what have you done before now. Even when I'm doing a press conference, when I stood there Friday speaking about the death of George Floyd and so many other people, it was focused on that day and that issue. And that's why I think these other ways of communicating, whether it be a podcast or in written form, is so incredibly important. Because the question, I've not been asked that question in terms of what we've done. I've been asked questions about criminal justice reform, and I've had the opportunity to talk about closing our jail in Atlanta and converting it to a center of equity, health, and wellness, the process that we're going through to do that. I've had a chance to say, you know, when we've had this conversation around defunding police, we've already slashed our corrections budget by 60% and putting that towards the conversion of our jail for all of these things that we've talked about, mental health services, wraparound services. But I've not had a chance to talk about the implicit bias training that our officers receive, or the requirement that our new police recruits have to volunteer in the At Promise Youth Center so they can create relationships with our kids, or even, there's so many other things that I can name, but I think it's very difficult to get all of that out when you're giving 2-minute sound bites, which again goes back to what we talked about initially, this challenge. And how do you convince that information? And one challenge that we consistently have, and is always top of mind for my team, we're constantly reacting to information. And we oftentimes don't have the ability to stand still long enough to proactively communicate information. And so so you're not always on the defense. And what I said Friday, and I've said it since then, the grace of God is sufficient. So I think that we've had God's grace over our city. But in addition to that, I think any additional grace that we've gotten from the public during this time is because we've probably done a better job communicating with the public, because we have more time to communicate with the public on the things that we're doing within our communities. But there's always room for improvement, and certainly room and more opportunity for us to better communicate.
Mayor, let me make a suggestion to you. You know, one of the most moving experiences I ever had was when I toured Martin Luther King's boyhood home. And Bernice King had invited me to Atlanta on Martin Luther King Day, and just to walk the streets. Let me suggest to you, do events. Call Bernice King. Tell her that you want to go to Martin Luther King's boyhood home. They'll all show up to cover you. And talk about the things that you're doing, talking about the kind of changes that you're bringing in Atlanta. People will see it. They'll see the video. It'll be on social media. You will get attention. And I think a part of this is to get off not always be on the defense, is to get out there and create these events so you can show people what you're doing, the things that you're doing that are positive to bring about a resolution. I don't tell you how to do your job, but if I was your press person, I would be telling you, you need to be out there, because you have that certain something that is that leads to success.
Well, and I appreciate that, Governor. And just by way of example, I was on communicating with Bernice King this morning about meeting with some of the activists in the city. And so again, all these things that happen and we do as leaders, but they don't always see the light of day in terms of how we communicate that to the public. And I know that, you know, there is a need for us to keep the public informed, because otherwise others have the opportunity to fill in the blank. And even over the past week, it's been very clear to me. I work very hard to stay out of the comment section because you can get sucked in. But it has been very clear to me over the last week that there is an outside force attempting to shape a narrative. I saw it after Friday, and I won't get too far gone with who and what I think those outside forces are, but I'll just say I don't think interference ended in 2016.
Well, the only thing I'll add is when I think about the media in this moment, and also responsibility of our elected leaders, is one of the things that I've seen as somebody who sort of has squarely been in the policing space as my sort of contribution to the larger conversation about criminal justice, is that reporters bounce around so much that they very rarely anymore have expertise. Yes. So every time something comes up, we're like, you know, I'm trying to teach the New York Times person about police unions because he's never written about them before. He's writing a big piece about it. I'm trying to like explain something really complicated in a very short time. So he calls Mayor Bottoms. He asks her the wrong question. You know, it's just like, so that becomes a nightmare. Yeah. I think the other thing is that what I am surprised by is, at least in the policing space, and I know we're talking about this moment, is that there are 5 things that the data has shown don't matter, right? Just doesn't matter. And like the reporters don't even ask the police, so don't even ask the mayor. So like implicit bias training, mental health training for police officers, no impact on behavior. Body cameras, single biggest study on body camera shows has no impact on use of force. The number of Black officers, interestingly, actually does matter, but it doesn't matter until the department gets to be over 35% Black. And then police violence decreases, interestingly enough, but there are only 12 police departments in the country that are more than 30% Black. And the 5th is community policing, also interesting, cool idea, but community policing, the data shows, only changes police attitudes and not behavior, right? So like the data says that, the research says it, but people stand up and be like, I'm data informed. And you're like, well, what data were you, like, show me the data. I want to see the report that like informed that strategy. And not to say these things can't be important in some way, but they just don't have a relationship to officers using force, right? And it's that sort of stuff that like, you know, I do want elected officials teams to be better at, but I also want reporters to like ask the question when they roll out this new initiative. And you're like, yeah, but the data doesn't say that like, that's going to change community attitudes, which is sort of interesting. It doesn't change like the behavior of either group. That's something that like I've become more aware of since 2014.
But the reality is we're dealing with, you know, shrinking newsroom staffs, digital disruption that has just sort of upended the business model for so much of media. So you're right, reporters are parachuting into places without not a lot of knowledge and trying to get up to speed very quickly. How do we bridge that gap then? I mean, how do you as an activist think about how to engage with those reporters? I know it's got to be exhausting to have to educate every new reporter who comes along, but this is where we are right now. Again, yeah, how do we bridge that? How do we get past that? Yeah,
so we do a lot of like background conversations just about like, just so you understand, we're like, hey, just so you get it. But I do think that like, you know, not that I'm gonna say what you just said is an excuse, but I think about the number of people who specialize in Donald Trump today, and I'm shocked. I'm like, I don't even know how you remember Live 2000 because we're on Live 25,000, right?
Fair enough.
You figure out a way to track all of that. You know, every time he went to Mar-a-Lago, when he didn't go to Mar-a-Lago, how much gas he used. Like, you know, you figured out how to log a whole lot of information about a man that we don't love. In this issue where people are dying, you're like, what is a police union? And I'm like, what? You know, like that is unacceptable. So like,
that's fair.
You know, I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even as we were talking, I had a point that I wanted to make. I'm like, what was the other point? Well, the other point, even we had a shooting of an unarmed man. One of our officers was on loan to a federal task force. Well, they wouldn't allow our officers to wear body cam as a part of this federal task force. So we pulled all of our officers from the federal task force because they wouldn't allow us to wear body cams. Well, I think that's a pretty big deal. But that's not something that we're talking about, and not something I can even always remember. And as elected officials, and I'm sure many other people who speak publicly, you're constantly reminded, message discipline, message discipline, message discipline. And part of the reason is just what you said, because you cannot assume that reporters have the background information, and you've always got to assume that you're talking to somebody who is uninformed. But the problem with message discipline is that you stay on one message and you don't always get into the nuances and the caveats that can give full context.
Right.
Dean, this is where it falls. This is where it falls on you, my friend. You know, that's what I was saying about media having these deep-seated values and character when it comes to doing their job. You know, they cover the president because they get numbers, right? You know, that's why they go there. So the question is, what can you do when you have these young people there at your school, great school at Northwestern, and you're able to teach them about, no, I'm serious about how you cover. And what I always like to say to reporters is, you know, don't be somebody that plays the gotcha game all the time. You spend so much of your time doing gotcha. Those are not the reporters that win. It's the reporters who can follow the story. They're the reporters that do deep background, who are knowledgeable, that gain the respect of people who are in public life. And so part of it is training them. And I think it's also true, as you mentioned, you know, newspapers have cut back, you know, the media is scrambling because of the digital influence, but we'll survive this. We'll get through this. We'll just be creative and do things differently. But it all gets down to whether somebody has the determination to do something that they think represents justice in our country, fairness in our country. And maybe it's also the responsibility to some degree of public figures to also try to educate them. I always tried to do that when I was in public office, and I think sometimes they resented it, but that's okay. And I also went to look for those reporters who I thought had it, those reporters who I thought had depth, that they had an understanding of what we were talking about, and that they were willing to work on the story where they might be a little bit lonely, but at the end, they can emerge as somebody that is significant in the newsroom.
Mr. Mckesson, what is the relationship between media and contemporary activists, if you will? I mean, I think of the Black Lives Matter movement when I think so much media is confounded by not feeling as though they have a spokesperson who can give them a soundbite, you know, at the spur of the moment, and they are scrambling, therefore, to figure out how to cover activism. That's sort of my outside perspective from the ivory tower. What is your sense of the way we're covering kind of the grassroots movements of the day?
I think that might have been true in 2014. I think that now, like, you know, there are enough leaders at the city level, at the national level, so like people have the language. I spend most of my time sort of challenging reporters behind the scenes, being like, you know, like the police, mayors are really funny because, you know, I'm either working with the mayor or sort of pushing up against the mayor or getting people to call the mayor, you know, because there's 18,000 police departments and mayors really have the most power when we think about like levers here. But a lot of mayors they defer to the police chief, right? Like they're like, well, you know, the police chief will be like, you've never been a mayor before, da-da-da. So the police chiefs have a lot of power in a lot of these cities. And what we always say to people, reporters, this is what I say to mayor, I'm like, if that was your mother in the hospital and the doctor said something that made no sense, like just didn't, you have never been a doctor in your whole life, and you know what they said made no, you'd be like, yeah, I don't know. Like, you wouldn't be like, you know what, there's a hospital, let me just like, you would be like, yeah, second opinion. you know, like, so we try to take people out of the police narrative and sort of put them somewhere else. And then they like normally are like, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. And like, that's sort of what we do, because the police will say things like, you know, if you say I can't chokehold somebody, it's gonna like restrict. You're like, how many people you gotta choke? You know, or like one of the things we advocate for is, you know, you should have to report every time that you point your gun at somebody or threaten to point your gun at somebody, right? And the police would be like, that's a burden. And I'm like, well, if I go outside and wave a gun in the air at somebody, that's aggravated assault. And when I go to court and say that's a burden, people are gonna be like, DeRay, see you in jail. Like, that would be unacceptable. When the police do it, we're like, what? And when we say to the police, how many people are you pointing guns at? Like, this should be an easy reporting requirement, because you shouldn't be doing that, right? So some of it is like, how do we normalize these things for reporters and even for elected officials? Because what we find from the police is that they really are, and this isn't even, I'm not even saying this shady, they are some of the best propagandists I've ever, I'm like, y'all got this message down, you know? So some of it is like, how do we like give other people language to sort of push and challenge and ask? And I think about recently, you know, we launched this thing about use of force policies, and we got, you know, one city, the police union was like, are you saying that my line officers are supposed to walk around with the standard operating procedures on the corners to decide what to do? And I'm like, well, if you need a book to tell you not to shoot at somebody in a moving vehicle, then you probably shouldn't be on the force today anyway. Like we actually have to like push people in this. And that's what I spend a lot of time doing with reporters.
And can I just add something? And I'm dating myself. When I was a student at FAMU, the gold standard was Northwestern, Missouri, and there were 3 accredited HBCUs, which are—
What do you mean you're dating yourself? That's still a gold standard.
It was FAMU, Howard, and Jackson State, I think, were the 3. And the standards were so high. And my professor, Professor Wilson, you could have an amazing story written. And when I interned at the Tallahassee Democrat, if you had one misspelled wrong word,
that's an F.
Or you got an F. And when I look at our daily paper, and at the risk of sounding like a whiner, I'm going, well, what did your professors teach you? Because there's so many inaccuracies. And this is not a neutral story. This should get an F. I would have gotten an F on this. And that on the other side of it, as an elected official, that is my frustration. We don't, at least from our office, I don't ask that you favor me. I just ask that you be neutral and you give the facts, which then goes back to, again, that Donald Trump guy. He's mastered that. He doesn't rely on the daily paper or the daily newscast to get the facts. He puts out his idea of what facts are, and he gets it to the masses, which there's a benefit to that because you have control over your messaging. But of course, the downside of that is just what we've seen. If your messaging is flawed and it's inaccurate, it becomes propaganda that can be very harmful.
5 minutes. I want to jump in and get a quick answer to from each of you. What have we learned from the media's coverage since George Floyd's death? What do you think the big lessons are, the big takeaways? Mr. Mckesson?
I don't know if I've learned much this go around. I think what is important is that the public has seen the violence of the police, like really openly, especially because everybody's home. So when I think about those videos of like the police officers busting in that car or the police officers arresting that officer or like shooting rubber bullets, it's like everybody, like nobody's at work right now. So everybody saw that. And like, you know, that I literally watched that change people who had criticized us forever. Been like, y'all are being dramatic. The police don't really do. And then everybody saw it. And like, I've seen that be a sea change.
Mayor Bottoms?
I think the lesson I've learned is that the media have not been desensitized to police killings, because at some point it did feel that way because we see it so much, and sometimes you have to stop and think, okay, now which one was that? And what I've learned during the past almost 2 weeks there is still a heightened sensitivity, and you know, we've talked a lot about what made this one different, but I think that's been the biggest takeaway, that there is still a real sensitivity to it. It is unfortunate that it took the murder of this innocent man in this way for us to see that sensitivity still exists.
And Governor Kasich?
I think it's clear to me that the country is united in wanting reform. And they don't want just rhetoric, they don't want just talk, they want reform. And they want an answer to this. And to me, that's what makes me optimistic.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. What a wonderful conversation. It was great talking to each of you and meeting you virtually, as they say.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Paley Center for inviting me and inviting us all.